Widow with 3 sons rescues a wounded man, unaware he is the most dreaded Duke. The November wind cut through the worn wool of Campbell MacLeod's plaid as her weathered boots pressed into the sodden moorland. She gripped the shoulders of her 3 sons, Callum, the oldest at 14, his young face hardened with responsibility. Lachlan, 11 summers, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness ahead. And Finlay, only 8 winters, who whimpered softly against the sting of rain that no child should know. Her fingers trembled against their cloaks, not from the biting cold, but from something deeper, something that had festered for 6 months, ever since they buried Duncan. 6 months. Just 6 months since her beloved husband had been laid in the cold earth, and already her brother-in-law Dougal had come like a vulture to carrion. He expelled them as if they were vermin to be swept from a threshold. Dougal MacLeod, mean-spirited and greedy, had seized the family lands with a speed that revealed this had been his plan all along, waiting, watching, circling. A widow has no rights over male property, he declared before the village vicar, holding a document that Campbell had never seen before. A testament, he claimed, Duncan's true will, where everything, every stone, every field, every legacy, was left to the older brother. Campbell's mother-in-law, Lady Moira, had not shed a single tear. She had only watched with eyes like flint as Campbell was literally pushed beyond the gates, her bundle of belongings tearing as it fell into the mud and filth of the courtyard. "Take your bastards and never come back," Dougal had spat. The cruelty of those words still burned, as if 12 years of marriage, 12 years of devotion to this clan, could be erased by a forged line of ink. As if Duncan hadn't fathered these boys with his own hands, hadn't loved them fiercely, hadn't been taken from them far too soon. The rain had begun the moment they left the gates. Not a gentle Highland mist, but dense curtains of water, ice cold and relentless, soaking them to the bone until Campbell wasn't sure where the rain ended and her tears began. She'd led her sons away from the main road toward the village, hoping to find refuge with Morag, an old companion, a woman who understood loss and survival. But the darkness came too quickly. The forest closed in, and by the time Campbell realized they would not reach safety before nightfall, there was nowhere to turn but the wild places of her youth. The ancient stone shelter, nothing more than rocks piled by shepherds centuries past, became their refuge. It was miserable, barely more than a depression in the moorland, but it was better than nothing. Campbell tried to light a fire with damp kindling while her 3 sons huddled together against the other wall. Their small bodies pressed for warmth they could not generate. There was no dry wood. There was no food except half a loaf of oat bread that Campbell had managed to pocket before they were thrown out, rationed now into smaller pieces than their hunger deserved. Callum had stopped complaining hours ago. Lachlan kept making jokes, terrible, brave little jokes, that made his brothers smile despite their shivering. But Finlay was watching his mother with an expression that broke something in her chest. It wasn't fear in his small face. It was understanding. The terrible, too early understanding that everything familiar had been taken, that life would never return to what it was, that survival itself was no longer promised. "Mama," Finlay whispered, his voice small as a bird's. "Uncle Dougal said we're worthless, that we're bastards without a father's name to protect us." The words hit Campbell like a blade. She felt her throat tighten, felt the lump of despair rising in her chest. But she looked at her 3 sons, these boys who had done nothing to deserve this, and she knelt before them in the darkness, gathering them close, her hands rough and trembling but certain. "Listen to me," she said, and her voice, though it shook, carried the weight of absolute truth. The measure of a person does not come from land or gold. It does not come from the words of bitter men or forged documents. It lives in your blood, in your loyalty, in your heart. You are MacLeods. That means you protect your own. It means you help those in need, no matter the cost. It means your word is your bond, and your character is your inheritance." Callum's jaw tightened. Lachlan's eyes glistened in the firelight, and Finlay, small, brave Finlay, nodded as if he understood that his mother had just given him something more valuable than all of Dougal's stolen lands. Campbell pulled them close, and they sat together in the shelter of ancient stones, 3 boys and a mother who had nothing left but each other and the fierce love that bound them together. It was then that the sky seemed to tear open completely. A thunderclap, louder than anything Campbell had ever heard, echoed across the moorland so violently that all 3 sons screamed. The sound came an instant later, a sound that was impossible to ignore even above the roaring of the storm, a desperate neigh, high and terrified. And then the heavy thud of something enormous falling hard against the earth, the sound of impact, of weight hitting stone and mud. And then, worse than anything else, a human groan, muffled by rain and distance, but unmistakably laden with mortal pain. Campbell rose slowly, her heart suddenly, impossibly awake in her chest. She looked at her 3 sons, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Stay here," she ordered, and the authority in her voice brooked no argument. "Don't move from this shelter. No matter what you hear, you stay here with each other. Understood?" "Mama, no!" Callum grabbed her plaid, fear and anger warring in his young face. It could be anything. It could be dangerous. "Aye," Campbell said quietly, already moving toward the darkness. "It could." She stepped forward into the rain, following the sound of the groan. The storm lashed at her face, but she continued, picking her way carefully through the treacherous mud and loose stones. Her breath came hard, her mind clear. Someone was dying out there. Someone was trapped. That was all that mattered. The lightning came again, and in its pale, terrible light, she saw it. A magnificent black horse, massive and beautiful even in death, lying sideways across the muddy track. The saddle was made of fine leather, ornate with silver buckles that gleamed despite the mud and rain. The reins were adorned with the kind of craftsmanship only nobility could afford. Even in the darkness, even covered in mud and blood, the evidence of the rider's station was unmistakable. And beneath the horse, his left leg trapped and crushed beneath the animal's full weight, his body twisted at an angle that made Campbell's healer's mind scream in warning, was a man. A man who was clearly no peasant. A dark cloak of fine wool, a black velvet doublet, leather boots of undeniable quality. On his right hand, not a signet ring glinted despite the mud and rain, a mark of nobility that could not be mistaken. The seal depicted a fortress, ancient and imposing. Blood ran from a wound at his temple, mixing with the rain, running into the mud beneath him. He was unconscious, but he was breathing. Campbell knelt beside him in the rain, her mind already working through the impossible task before her. The horse was too heavy. She could never move it alone. The man's leg was clearly broken, possibly shattered. Moving him incorrectly could kill him as surely as leaving him would. But she also knew this with absolute certainty. She would not leave him to die. Not here. Not in this storm. Not while she still had breath in her body and strength in her hands. She turned and ran back toward the shelter, her mind already calculating, already planning. What could be done? What had to be risked? What her sons could help with? And what would require her to choose between her own family's safety and the life of a stranger? The choice, when it came to her in the rain, was no choice at all. What Campbell didn't know was that the man trapped beneath that horse was the most feared person in all of Scotland, the dreaded Duke of Dunloch, a man whose name alone could empty taverns, a man whispered about in drawing rooms with fear, a man known for cruelties that mothers used to frighten their children into obedience. One in a few hours, when the guards found them, Campbell's entire world would transform in ways she could never have imagined. Let's see what happens when survival meets destiny. Come with me, Campbell commanded Callum, her voice steady despite the wind that tried to tear her words away. Bring the branches Lachlan gathered. Bring cloth. Quickly now. Callum's face was pale in the darkness, but he didn't argue. His eldest son had learned the language of necessity. They moved together through the rain, and when they reached the clearing where the man lay, Callum only paused for a moment before understanding what had to be done. We need to free his leg from the horse, Campbell said, her voice shifting into something different. The voice of a healer who had seen wounds before and knew the mathematics of survival. The weight is crushing it. If we don't move it soon, the leg will die, even if the man lives. How? Callum's voice was steady as Highland stone, though he was only 14. You push the horse, Campbell said simply. I'll dig and ease his leg free. It will hurt him, even unconscious. But the alternative is amputation or death. They worked without speaking. Campbell moved to the trapped leg, her fingers finding the angle of the stone, assessing. The horse was still breathing, its flanks heaving with pain and fear. There was no time for gentleness. Push, she commanded, and Callum moved to the horse's shoulder. Bracing himself against the weight, Campbell dug. Her hands found purchase in the mud, and she began to excavate around the crushed leg, inch by agonizing inch. Her nails broke, blood mixed with rain and dirt, but she did not stop, could not stop. Beside her, Callum threw his young strength against the horse's weight, his face twisted with effort. Again, Campbell breathed. The horse shifted, just barely, just enough. Campbell's fingers found the man's leg and began to carefully ease it free. His groan of pain was muffled by unconsciousness, his body moving like a puppet on broken strings. One final pull, and the leg came free. They dragged him away from the horse, his body limp and heavy. Campbell's breath came in ragged gasps as she knelt beside him, already assessing. Head wound, bleeding but not catastrophic. Leg, clearly broken, the bone possibly shattered below the knee. She ran her hands over his ribs, checking for puncture wounds, for the wet feeling of internal bleeding. His breathing was shallow but steady. Find me branches, she said to Callum. Straight ones, as long as your forearm. While Callum searched, Campbell tore strips from the hem of her already ruined dress and used them to stop the bleeding from the man's temple. Her hands moved with the precision of years. Births she had attended, accidents she had treated, wounds she had bound. This was not her first time saving a life. Callum returned with branches, and together they splinted the man's leg, wrapping it carefully with cloth and binding it tight. The man groaned but did not wake, his body surrendering to shock and pain. When it was done, Campbell sat back in the mud and rain, her chest heaving. Only then did she notice Callum looking at her, not with the fear of a boy watching his mother risk everything, but with the profound respect of a young man witnessing true strength. We need to get him inside, Callum said, and his voice was steady as stone. I will help carry him. Campbell looked at her eldest son, mud-covered, rain-soaked, his face marked by exhaustion and purpose, and she saw that he had crossed a threshold. The boy who had left the shelter was not the boy who had returned. He had become something harder, something necessary. Together, they carried the injured man back to the shelter, Finley and Lachlan watching with wide eyes as their mother and brother laid him on a makeshift pallet of plaids they'd salvaged. The man's body was dead weight, his skin already burning with fever. If you know someone who's ever sacrificed everything to protect the people they love, if you know someone who refused to turn away from suffering no matter the cost, share this story with them right now, because sometimes we all need to remember what real strength looks like. The fever came in the deep hours of the night, and with it came the man's demons. Campbell had moved him as carefully as she could, positioning his leg to prevent further damage. Callum sat vigil while she tended the other two boys, and by the time she returned, sweat was pouring from the stranger's skin despite the November cold. His eyes moved beneath closed lids, seeing something only fever could show him. "No," he groaned, his voice raw with anguish. "Not the gate, not again. The children, where are the children?" Campbell knelt beside him and began to work, stripping away the wet fabric of his shirt, replacing it with dry cloth. She wrung out water with her own hands and pressed it to his burning skin, working with the practiced efficiency of someone who had fought fever before and won. "Hush now," she murmured, though she knew he could not hear her. "You are safe." Callum watched from across the shelter, his jaw tight, his hand resting on a stone he had chosen for a weapon if needed. This man, whoever he was dangerous simply by being here, by drawing them into his story. Through the night, the man called out names. Kieran. That was what he called himself, over and over, the West Tower. Sometimes he addressed Campbell and Callum as warriors, barking orders about defenses and strategy. Other times his voice softened, and he called for someone named Margaret, his words desperate with longing and regret. "I'm sorry," he whispered, over and over. "Margaret, I'm sorry. I didn't understand. I didn't know how to love you without destroying you." Campbell's hands stilled. In those fever dreams, she heard the echo of a man's deepest wounds. She heard what the legends didn't tell, that the dreaded Duke had not always been cruel, that something had broken him into cruelty. By dawn of the third day, the fever had broken. His eyes opened to consciousness slowly, confusion clouding them as he took in the stone walls, the makeshift shelter, the widow kneeling beside him with healer's hands. Lachlan was there too, offering water with surprising gentleness, and Finlay, brave, impossible Finlay, had gathered wildflowers and laid them in a small circle around the man's palate, as if trying to make beauty from desperate circumstances. "Who are you?" the man asked, his voice hoarse and fractured. His dark eyes studied her face with an intensity that was almost frightening. Campbell sat back on her heels. She had been waiting for this question, had rehearsed her answer 100 times in the hours she tended him. "I am Campbell MacLeod," she said simply. "This is my son Callum. These are my other sons, Lachlan and Finlay. We are Highlands people, and we do not leave the wounded to die. Not for gold, not for station, not for any reason." The man stared at her, and then something flickered across his face. A moment of disbelief, then something that looked almost like hunger. His eyes moved across her face, across Callum's guarded expression, across the flower-bedecked shelter that held him like a prayer. And then he laughed. It was not a sound of mockery or hysteria. It was something deeper, a laugh that seemed to come from a place long locked away, rusted shut from disuse. It was the sound of a man remembering what laughter felt like, the sound of ice cracking. "Highlands people," he repeated, his eyes still locked on hers. I remember what that means." There was something in those words, something like acknowledgement, like a man recognizing a truth he had forgotten. Campbell felt Callum's wariness shift slightly, though his hand still rested on the stone. This stranger was clearly a nobleman. That was evident from his bearing, from the quality of even his torn clothing, from the signet ring that caught the light like a small flame. But what was a nobleman doing out in a Highland storm? And why did his fever dreams speak of regret and apology? "I am Kieran," he said slowly, his voice gaining strength. "Kieran of Dunloch." The name meant nothing to Campbell. She turned it over in her mind like a stone, finding no particular weight to it. But behind her, Callum made a sound, a sharp intake of breath that cut through the shelter like a blade. "The Duke of Dunloch," Callum whispered, and his voice carried the kind of fear that came from old stories told to keep children obedient. The dreaded Duke, the one they say. Campbell raised her hand, and Callum fell silent, though she could feel his panic thrumming through the shelter like an animal's heartbeat. She turned back to the man, to Kieran, and looked at him truly. Weakened by injury and fever, his face was still marked by exhaustion, but his eyes were clear now. They watched her with an intensity that took her breath, as if he was trying to memorize every line of her face. She thought of how he had watched Finlay gathering flowers, how his eyes had softened with something like longing. She thought of the name he had called in fever, Margaret, the gate, the children, and she saw no monster. She saw a man who had laughed like he'd forgotten how to do it. She saw a man who had been alone for so long that kindness had become a foreign language. Kieran of Dunloch was a man with a reputation for cruelty. But in this shelter, surrounded by a widow and her children who had saved his life without knowing who he was, he found something he thought he'd lost forever. And Campbell, looking at him with neither fear nor judgment, saw something the rest of Scotland had forgotten, that even the most broken people can be redeemed. But would she survive the cost of believing in him? Over the next days, as Kieran's strength slowly returned, Campbell made a decision. She would not ask him about his past. She would not demand explanations for his reputation. Instead, she would judge him by what she saw, a man who watched Finlay with something like wonder, a man who asked Lachlan about his jokes with genuine interest, a man who looked at Callum with respect for his courage. But there was something else, something that kept her awake at night, her heart racing with a fear she didn't dare name. She knew who he was, or rather, she knew what the world said he was, the dreaded Duke, a man who had made enemies of powerful clans, a man who had taken land by force, punished disloyalty with cruelty, and kept his own people in terror through sheer will and the threat of violence. One afternoon, when the other boys were asleep and Callum stood watch outside, Campbell knelt beside Kieran's pallet. "Tell me," she said quietly, "tell me what the world whispers about you." Kieran's jaw tightened. For a long moment, she thought he would refuse. Then he reached out and gently caught her hand. "My family was not kind," he said, his voice low and careful. "My father ruled through fear. My mother died when I was young. I had a brother, the younger, and a woman I believed I loved. Margaret." Campbell felt Callum's presence at the shelter entrance, listening. She didn't tell him to leave. "I was betrothed to Margaret for political reasons," Kieran continued, "but I came to believe it was more. I thought I loved her. I thought she loved me. When I discovered she had been unfaithful, when I discovered she had done it deliberately, to wound me, He paused, pain crossing his features. "I became the thing my father had raised me to be. Cruel. Vindictive. I hurt her. Not physically, but I took her reputation, her position, her future. I destroyed her to prove that I could not be destroyed by her." His hand tightened on Campbell's. "And when she disappeared, when she took her own life, some said, I told myself it was her weakness, not my cruelty. I told myself that was simply the way power operated, that mercy was weakness." Campbell listened, and she heard the truth beneath the words. This was not a man confessing pride. This was a man finally speaking aloud the thing that had haunted him. "The whispers about my cruelty grew," Kieran said. "Some were true, some were exaggerated, but I did nothing to correct them, because fear was easier than the risk of being loved and betrayed again. Fear kept people at a distance. Fear meant I would never again make the mistake of believing in love." "Until now," Campbell said quietly. "Until now," Kieran agreed. And when he looked at her, she saw something that terrified her absolutely. Hope. The possibility that he might believe redemption was real. Kieran could barely walk, but he was determined. Campbell watched as he struggled to his feet, his legs splinted and throbbing, his face pale with effort. Callum moved instinctively to support him, though his eyes remained guarded, still measuring, still calculating. The storm had broken. The Highland sun was weak but present, illuminating a landscape of wind-twisted grass and ancient stone. Kieran looked out at it with the expression of a prisoner seeing sunlight after years in darkness. "I cannot stay here," he said simply, "and neither can you." It was not a command, though it carried the weight of one. It was a statement of fact, wrapped in something that sounded almost like an apology. Campbell's mind was already 3 steps ahead, as it always was. The shelter would not hold them through winter. Their food was nearly gone. The Highland cold would only deepen, and Kieran's wounds, though healing, would need more care than she could provide here. But there was something else, something that terrified her more than any storm. If she left with him, if she took her sons to his castle, she would be placing them under the protection of a man whose name inspired fear. Dougal would learn where they were, and then, "Come with me to Dunloch Castle," Kieran said, reading the conflict in her face. "Bring your sons. I will restore your lands, not as payment for saving me, but because Dougal MacLeod is no fit to hold them, because the MacLeod name deserves better than a thief and a coward." Callum stepped forward, his young jaw clenched. "And why would we trust that? Why would we believe you would honor such a promise?" Kieran turned to face the boy who was becoming a man. "Because I am asking you to trust me not as a duke, but as a man who has spent years being feared and now understands, finally, what it means to be worthy of respect. Because if I break this promise, I lose the one thing the fear never gave me: your mother's belief in my capacity for good." Campbell felt something shift in her chest. This was not a nobleman making a strategic move. This was a deeply wounded man offering his entire self, past, present, and future, on the chance that she might help him become something better than the legend. "Come with me," Kieran said again, extending his hand. "Bring your sons to Dunloch Castle. I will restore your lands to the MacLeod name. I will ensure your safety. But most of all, I will spend every day proving to you that the man you saved in the mud is worth believing in." Campbell looked at her eldest son, the boy who had learned to be a protector, who had carried wounded dukes and defended his family. Then she looked at Lachlan and Finlay, who had somehow found joy even in despair. And she understood that her sons needed more than she could give them alone. They needed education, safety, the possibility of a future beyond survival. She took Kieran's hand. "We will come," she said, "but know this. If you betray my sons, if you use this position to hurt them or exploit them, I will end you myself, Highland's law or not." Kieran's grip tightened. I would expect nothing less. The journey to Dunloch Castle would take 3 days. But it was not just a physical journey. Campbell was walking toward a choice that would cost her everything: her reputation, her safety, possibly even the future of her sons. Because in Scotland, the dreaded Duke's reputation would reach her before they did, and what the household of Dunloch would do when they discovered their Duke had brought home a widow and 3 boys. That was a price Campbell could never fully calculate. Let's see what happens when they arrive at the castle gates. The journey to Dunloch Castle took 3 days. Kieran moved slowly, but with each mile, something in his bearing shifted, the careful gentleness of the shelter giving way to the natural authority of a man accustomed to command. By the time the castle gates rose before them, ancient and imposing, he was transformed back into the Duke, though something essential had changed in his core. His household reacted as Campbell had feared: shock, whispered questions, the careful distance of people uncertain how to receive a peasant widow and 3 ragged boys. But Kieran's voice, when he spoke, carried an edge that silenced all doubt. "These people are under my protection," he said simply. "They will be treated with the respect due to honored guests. Any who question this will answer to me." The lieutenant, a stern warrior named Ian, his face carved from the same Highland stone as the castle itself, stepped forward, his bearing conflicted. "Your Grace," Ian said carefully, "you are not thinking clearly. The woman could be a spy. The boys could be used against you. You are recently injured and—" "I am thinking more clearly than I have in years," Kieran interrupted, his voice carrying absolute authority. "These people saved my life when I was nothing to them, when I was dying in a Highland storm, cast out and alone. That is all I need to know. That is all any loyal servant of Dunloch needs to know." Ian studied Campbell for a long moment, measuring her. Then he turned back to Kieran. "As you command, Your Grace. The East Wing has been prepared for the widow and her sons." Campbell felt Callum relax slightly beside her, but it was not relief she felt. It was the weight of responsibility settling deeper into her shoulders. They were in the dreaded Duke's castle now, and she had brought her children into the domain of a man the world feared. The winter changed them all in ways Campbell had not anticipated. Where she had once hidden her competence, she now wielded it openly. The castle's household, servants who had been skeptical, even hostile, began to listen to her quiet commands with the respect they once reserved for Kieran. She moved through the great hall with purpose, not asking permission, but making decisions with the certainty of a woman who had learned to trust her own judgment. She reorganized the kitchens, improved the supplies management during the harsh Highland winter, and even convinced Ian to accept her suggestions about the household's defense. Even Ian, the stern lieutenant who had questioned everything about her, had softened, seeing in her management of the castle's resources a wisdom that went beyond book learning. More than once, she caught him watching her with something that looked like respect, but it was Kieran's nephew who had broken open something in his chest. Lucas was 8 years old, the same age as Finley. He was the son of Kieran's younger brother, a boy hollowed out by loss and fear. His parents had been killed in a raid when he was young, and he had been taken in by Kieran out of obligation rather than affection. No one expected the boy to thrive. They expected him to survive at best. But Campbell had simply knelt beside him one afternoon and asked, as if it mattered enormously, what his favorite fish was. The question had seemed absurd, but she had meant it, and by spring, the boy who had not laughed in 2 years was teaching her to fish in the castle streams, reading the weather in the way the leaves turned, finding his place in a world that had tried to destroy him. Kieran watched it all, Campbell moving through his castle like she owned it, like she had always owned it. He watched her teach his nephew, watched his men straighten their shoulders when she passed, watched her in the mornings, standing alone in the gardens looking out toward the Highlands she had come from, and he understood with sudden, aching clarity. He was in love with her. It was not a gentle realization. It was not soft or romantic, or any of the things love was supposed to be. It was a recognition of home in a person. It was understanding, finally, what all those years of cruelty had been. A man building walls so high that even he could not climb out. One evening, as the spring sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and ash, Kieran found her in the gardens. She did not turn when she heard his footsteps, but her body straightened slightly, as if his presence changed the very air around them. "You have changed everything," he said quietly. My nephew laughs again. He speaks of his parents without pain. My household runs with purpose. My men respect me, not because I am fierce, but because they see I am capable of loyalty, of love. Campbell turned then, and he saw the fear in her eyes, the terror of hope. He moved closer, slowly, giving her time to step away if she chose. She did not. And you, he continued, Campbell, you have made me want to be something other than the dreaded Duke. He took her hand, not with demand, but with a question written into the touch. Will you stay with me? Not as my subject, as my equal, as my wife. The silence stretched between them like a living thing. Campbell's hand trembled in his, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. If I do this, Kieran, it is not an arrangement or a duty. I cannot love you halfway. My love is fierce and complete. It demands honesty. It demands that you never return to the darkness. And if I give it, I give my whole self, and I expect you to honor that with your entire being. He pulled her close then, and their kiss was not gentle. It was a vow spoken without words, a promise made by two people who had learned through fire and storm what it meant to truly need someone. It was the seal of a covenant that would change everything. When they pulled apart, both were trembling. Kieran rested his forehead against hers and whispered, "Then we are bound. From this moment forward, we are bound." Campbell did not answer in words. She simply held him closer, and in that embrace, her final walls came down. If you believe in second chances, if you believe that love can transform even the darkest hearts, if you've ever been the person everyone feared, or if you've ever been the person brave enough to love them anyway, subscribe to this channel, because every story we tell here is about the power of believing in someone when they can't believe in themselves. New stories like this one drop every week, and each one will remind you why hope is never wasted. Subscribe now so you don't miss a single moment. The great hall of the gathering was packed with Highland nobles, men and women who had come to witness what they assumed would be Kieran's announcement of a strategic marriage. Instead, they found themselves spectators to something far more dangerous, a man choosing love over politics. The tension was immediate. Whispers rippled through the crowd like stones thrown into still water. A duke marrying a widow of no noble blood was not scandal. It was a direct challenge to the order of things. Some clans saw opportunity, calculating how to leverage Campbell's influence. Others, loyal to Dougal, had come prepared to defend his claim to the MacLeod lands. But it was the woman who rose, beautiful, ambitious, her smile sharp as broken glass, who gave voice to what many were thinking. Lady Margaret, daughter of a powerful clan, a woman Kieran had once courted before his attention turned to Campbell. "Your Grace," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Before you make this decision, perhaps we should ask some questions." She turned to face the assembled clans, and Campbell felt the weight of every eye upon her. How do we know she has not bewitched him? How do we know she is not secretly plotting to steal his lands and power? She is no Highlands nobility. She is a widow, cast out by her own people, living in poverty. What kind of woman accepts such a rise except through deception? The accusation hung in the air like a blade suspended above water. Campbell felt it, the doubt, the judgment, the hunger of people who wanted to believe the worst. But then something unexpected happened. Callum stood. Not Campbell, not Kieran. Her 14-year-old son rose to his feet, his young face set with the dignity of a man years beyond his age. "My mother saved the Duke when she didn't know who he was," Callum said, his voice steady and clear. "When we were starving in a Highland storm, when we had nothing, she left the shelter where her own children were freezing to save a dying stranger. That is not the action of a deceiver, and that is the action of someone with a character you could not begin to understand." He turned to face Lady Margaret directly. "And my mother has spent 6 months making the castle better, teaching my brothers, honoring the people of this house. If that is deception, then I hope to be deceived by such goodness for the rest of my life." Callum sat down, and the hall was absolutely silent. Even Lachlan, for once, had no quip. Even Finlay held his breath. Then Campbell stood, not in anger, not in desperation, in the same quiet dignity that had carried her through a Highland storm with 3 starving sons. "I am Campbell MacLeod," she said, and her voice filled the hall not through volume but through absolute certainty. "I was cast out not because I am weak, but because my brother-in-law is a thief who feared my strength. I saved the Duke of Dunloch because I saw a dying man beneath a horse, not a title. I have not bewitched him, and I have only shown him what his own people have forgotten, that strength can be gentle, that loyalty is more valuable than gold, that a man is measured not by his cruelty, but by his capacity for love." She paused, letting her words settle into the silence like stones into deep earth. "The woman who cast me out feared me because I would not break. The man I saved respects me because I could not turn away from his suffering. I do not seek your approval for this union, but I will have your respect because I have earned it." The hall was absolutely silent. Then Kieran rose. He moved to Campbell's side with the deliberate slowness of a man claiming his territory, his hand finding hers with a gentleness that was somehow more powerful than any show of force. "This woman," he said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of the Duke of Dunloch, "is more noble in her character than anyone born with a dozen titles. She has taught me what it means to be worthy of power. She has shown me that a man can change, that the dreaded Duke does not have to remain a legend of cruelty. And I claim her as my wife, my equal, and my partner in transforming Dunloch from a place of fear into a place of hope." Ian stepped forward. "I doubted her when first she came, but I have seen her wisdom, her strength, her loyalty. If our Duke chooses her, I choose to follow." One by one, men and women rose, members of Kieran's household first, then, surprisingly, members of other clans, all drawn by something they recognized in Campbell's words and Callum's courage. By the time Lady Margaret sat down, frozen in shame, the entire room was on its feet. Campbell stood in the center of it all, finally seeing herself as others now saw her. Not a victim, but a force of nature. But not everyone at that gathering was convinced. Dougal MacLeod would learn that his cast-out sister-in-law had become a duchess. And when he discovered that the man she'd married had the power to take back the lands he'd stolen, when he realized she now had allies powerful enough to challenge him, his response would shake the foundations of Highland society. Next, you'll discover what Dougal does when faced with the possibility of losing everything. You'll see what a desperate man will risk to hold on to power. And you'll witness whether Campbell's newfound strength is enough to protect her family from those who want vengeance. Subscribe right now. The Standing Stones had witnessed 1,000 years of Highland winters, and they witnessed this one with the same ancient indifference. But on this day, something sacred moved beneath their shadow. Campbell stood barefoot on the earth where her ancestors had stood, where MacLeods before her had made covenants and sworn oaths. The plaid at her shoulders was new, but woven in the colors of her clan, deep greens and blacks that connected her to generations. Beside her, Kieran wore the colors of Dunloch, and together they made a statement written in fabric and presence. 2 clans, 2 people, 1 choice. Callum stood at her right hand, no longer a boy. He carried himself with the bearing of a young warrior, his eyes watchful and proud. Lachlan's sharp wit had been honed through months with Kieran into something deeper, wisdom that came from understanding that humor and truth were not opposites. And Finlay, brave, impossible Finlay, stood tall, his nightmares finally released into the Highland air where they could do no harm. Lucas, Kieran's nephew, stood beside his uncle, healed and whole, his young face bright with the joy of belonging. For the first time since losing his parents, The boy understood what it meant to be part of a family held together by choice as much as blood. The village elder spoke the words that had been spoken for centuries, his voice carrying the weight of tradition and time. Two people, forged in hardship, united in strength. Two souls that have learned to see beyond shadow and fear. Let the Highlands witness. They are bound. When Kieran pulled Campbell close, the sky opened into clear blue, as if the weeks of Highland rain had been a baptism. I'm washing away everything but truth. Their kiss was not gentle. It was a promise made flesh, a covenant sealed not just between two people, but witnessed by mountains and ancient stones and the people who loved them. Campbell whispered against his mouth, "I never thought my life could be this." Kieran's hands tightened in her hair, in her plaid, holding her as if she might dissolve into Highland mist. "Neither did I," he said, "but you have taught me that the dreaded Duke can be something better. You have taught me that love is not weakness, that believing in someone is the most powerful force in the world." The cheers that rose were not the hollow sound of court ceremony. They were genuine and wild, the sound of people who had witnessed something true. Even the November wind seemed to carry joy, swirling around the standing stones where a widow and a duke had chosen each other against every force that tried to keep them apart. The morning room at Dunloch Castle was flooded with spring sunlight. Campbell sat in a comfortable chair, nursing her daughter, a perfect, healthy girl with Kieran's dark eyes and her own determined chin. The baby had been born healthy and strong, exactly 1 year after they stood at the standing stones. Kieran entered quietly, as he always did, and stood watching them for a moment before approaching. And the expression on his face was one of wonder, the same wonder that had not faded since the day his daughter was born. "How is she?" he asked softly, touching the baby's tiny hand with gentle fingers. "Perfect," Campbell answered, and meant it completely. "Growing stronger every day." He kissed the top of his daughter's head, then leaned down to kiss Campbell's forehead. This simple gesture, this tender habitual affection, was something neither of them took for granted. It was the language of safety, of belonging, of a love that had transformed them both. Callum appeared in the doorway, tall now, trained as a warrior, his bearing marked by the confidence of a young man who knew his worth. Lachlan was with him, sharp-eyed and full of clever observations that made even Kieran laugh. And Finlay and Lucas burst in together, the two boys inseparable, arguing about who could catch the biggest fish in the castle streams. From the window, the Madame Ian, as Campbell had come to think of the stern lieutenant, observed the family with satisfaction. The dreaded Duke's home had become a place of genuine warmth. The servants moved with purpose and genuine contentment rather than fear. The castle itself seemed alive in a way it never had been before. Later that afternoon, Campbell stood in the herb garden with Kieran, the baby asleep in a basket at their feet, the boys playing nearby with wooden swords and dreams of adventure. Kieran had his arm around her waist, and she leaned against him, marveling at how natural this had become, this companionship, this partnership, this love. "I've been thinking," Kieran said, his voice thoughtful, "about what you said when we first met, about healing extending beyond the body. I'd like to establish a healing center in the village, a place where people can come for care, where your gift can be shared with those who need it most. What do you think?" Harriet turned to face him, seeing the future he was imagining, a future where her gift, which had once seemed like a worthless skill to her adoptive family, would bless hundreds, thousands perhaps. "I think," she said slowly, "that the dreaded Duke has truly become someone new." Kieran pulled her close, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, the heart that legend had said didn't exist, the heart that had healed when exposed to her belief in his goodness. "I love you," he said simply, "every moment of every day. I will never take this for granted." "I love you too," she replied, "for the man you are and for the man you're still becoming." That evening, as the household settled into sleep, Campbell walked through the castle's corridors. In every room, there was evidence of change. Laughter had replaced fear. Hope had replaced resignation. Love had transformed everything it touched. She paused in the portrait gallery, and there, among the stern-faced ancestors, hung two new portraits. One of Kieran, painted after their wedding, his expression open and vulnerable in a way no duke had been painted before, and one of Campbell, wearing her healing dress, herbs woven through her hair, her hand positioned over her heart. The inscription beneath read, "Campbell MacLeod, the healer who redeemed the dreaded Duke and transformed a kingdom." As Campbell stood before those portraits, she understood the full truth of what she had learned. She had been abandoned. She had been rejected. She had been deemed worthless. But love, true, persistent, believing love, had transformed her into exactly what she was meant to be: a healer, a wife, a mother, a woman worthy of belonging. And she finally, truly believed it. Before you go, I have a question for you. Do you think Campbell was right to trust Kieran? Or was she too quick to forgive the man the world called the dreaded Duke? Did he truly deserve her love, or was she blinded by hope? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every single comment, and I genuinely want to hear your perspective. And if you want to see the next story, where Dougal MacLeod discovers that his cast-out sister-in-law has become a duchess with the power to take everything from him, subscribe right now so you don't miss the moment when justice finally comes for the MacLeod name. Because what happens when Campbell faces her brother-in-law with her newfound power will change everything.